Elias, welcome to the Biohacking Beauty podcast. I'm very excited to have you on.
I'm excited to be here. Here we go.
Yes, sir. So to anyone listening, a little bit of context. Elias is a personal friend, also a personal friend of Young Goose. We rely a lot on his insight and intellect, and we consult with you, Elias, a lot, and we really appreciate everything that you've contributed to us. And we've met at a recent conference. We've reunited at a recent conference, which you gave a beautiful talk at, which is called RAADFest. Do you want to explain a little bit what RAADFest is? It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so RAADFest is kind of people who are into this idea of radical longevity. So most people think like longevity is extending the health span, like maybe, extending health span. So for those who are not familiar with the idea of lifespan and health span, and first off, thanks for having me. I don't think I said that yet.
Pleasure.
But it's great to be here. So for those of you not familiar, this idea that, we started living longer, right? So people used to live till like be 45. That used to be kind of like a lifespan. Now people live well beyond 45, but our health starts declining so severely from 45 to 70 that people are starting to point out the fact like, well, who cares then? Like if your health is just a inevitable decline into organ failure and cellular dysfunction and Alzheimer's, like that's probably not a good thing to just extend lifespan. So now the goal has become, let's extend health span. So let's say, okay, you at 45, that's, if we call that midlife, let's live to 90 but be healthy as possible the entire way.
It's almost like the the monster has risen and has eliminated the creator, right? The allopathic medicine, conventional medicine, basically has concentrated on preventing people from dying and is successful to an extent where the other part of it, which is quality of life or health span, as we call it, has kind of fallen to the waste side.
Well, I just think maybe, it wasn't really we weren't thinking, I think what's really amazing, and we'll probably get into this as we get into science, but, science sometimes just does things because it's like, is this possible, right? So it's kind of like the first step is it possible to get people to live beyond 45? Well, now we prove it. Okay, yeah, it's possible. People can live over 100, and you can go back to some ancient stories that suggest that this was not uncommon, but looking in the last, say, 500 years, people were not living to over 100, as often as they are today. So now we're like, okay, we can get people to live beyond 100, but now let's see if we can, keep them healthy the entire time. But what is interesting about the group at RAADFest is that's not near enough for them. They're not like they're like 100. You guys are wussies. I want to live to 1,000. I want to live to like, I don't even want to die. I want to become an immortal. And that I think it's a mix that has a mixed response amongst people, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, right? Because you think, well, wouldn't immortality be a human desire? But it appears that it's not. Like if you really suggest to most people or ask them, would you like to be immortal? Right? Because the biggest fear is supposed to be death. But if you really think about it, or you just ask people generally, their initial response is like, no, they don't want it. They don't want to live 500 years.
I agree. Well, I think this is a big topic, and I do want to cover it. But first, before we jump into the philosophy of or to the mental play of like what happens
the mental states of an immortal.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm working on that talk, right? Like the mindset of an immortal. That's actually one of my next talks.
That's beautiful. But within that concept, in order to even affect our health on a dramatic scale right now, we have to be our own experiment. And this is something that you've been preaching for a long time. You gave a talk at RAADFest about and the N equals one concept in citizen science as a whole. And I would love to kind of start a conversation there, since in order to affect your health, you have to be your own science project. How would you define citizen science or that N equals one?
Right. Perfect. So, and maybe I'll just define N equals one first, because that's kind of the thesis of the whole thing. And for those of you, in case you're not familiar with this idea, it's N refers to the number of participants in a clinical study. So if you have an
Mm-hmm.
N of 1,000 people in a study, that means there was 1,000 people that have participated. But as I often like to say, a population is not a person, right?
Yeah.
So everybody listening to this is a person. So even though a good study could have had 1,000 people, and they said it was really efficacious when they did cold plunging. So of 1,000 people, they found, the majority of them had improved parasympathetic activation by cold plunging. So you would say, well, that's great. I should start cold plunging. But then you
Mm-hmm.
start cold plunging and you just find that it's destroying your nervous system, right? Because you're an N of one. You're a person. You're not a population. You're an
Yeah.
individual. And so the future, and this is what my talk was about, I believe that the future of health and wellness is precise, personalized, and preventative.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of the thesis of my talk. And how do you get that is, you have to narrow in on that bioindividuality. And in the future, we'll have more tools for us to maybe do this en masse. But right now, you kind of have to be your own citizen scientist if you want to apply these principles.
Yeah, and I think what you're alluding to, that in the future, the ability to take, widely available technology and kind of have the reads on that being individualized to you is something that we're still in the process of. But what I love is that we're starting to see the technology, at least to provide the data to us.
Yes.
So how would you parcel out these the quantification of health? What are some of the points that you like to view?
So yeah, it's again, perfect question. And what I presented at RAADFest was like what I call the 5 factors of health. So these are 5 things that anybody can test. You don't need to wait for the future to make this possibility. You can just right now. All of the tests are available essentially for home or self-testing. The first one is very important, of course, which is genetics. So, you can get a genetic test rather easily today. The thing to keep in mind, I think, when you're talking about genetic testing is twofold. First is privacy. I think I think some people had some real eye-opening experiences around when the early genetic tests came out. I refused to do them. And everybody was like, well, why not? You're such a self-quantified guy. Why would you not do 23andMe? And I said, well, I looked at a bit of the agreement. And I said, our genetic data is going to be it's an extremely sensitive thing to share.
Yes.
Right? Your genome. And so I was skeptical that the early companies in this space were going to respect my privacy. And I was very justified by what happened later on. That data now has been sold.
Yeah.
So I swear to scare anybody who's done those tests, but a lot of the human genome data that was from some of these early companies, including 23andMe, has been essentially sold to the highest bidders, who can now do with that whatever they want. So there's a number of genetic companies today that are based around privacy and controlling your own that data. And again, even then, I guess you could even question that. Who knows? They could be acquired by another company in the future. Who knows?
But they can also be hacked. I mean, it's very simple to access that data if it's out there on a cloud.
Yeah, right. Or even being sent to you via an email, right?
Yeah.
So or through your dashboard that you might get. So
yeah.
That's the caveats here. So I like to try to give people the good and the bad of everything, so that they can get the full picture. So privacy, and then the other thing is the interpretation of your genetic data, because how genetic data is interpreted. We're constantly defining new ways of how to interpret this data, so that a SNP that predisposes you, for example, to alcohol dependency, that's something that, but the interesting thing is you could have that gene, that predisposition, but this is not your destiny. And I think this is one of the big differences in medicine in the last even 20 years, is we used to think your genes were your destiny. And so now we're realizing, well, that you may have a predisposition towards a genetic expression, but does it get expressed? You could live your entire life and never have that gene expressed.
Yeah.
So that's epigenetics, and that's a rapidly growing field where we're realizing that, the genes may or may not be expressed based upon environmental inputs. And so genetics, though, an important test. So I'll keep going unless you want to add anything to genetics.
No, I mean, just to simplify it, I always think of what can we look around in nature and understand that ability of our genes either to be expressed on or not expressed. And we can think of even like bunnies or hares that turn white when the temperatures get cold enough. I mean, like if we take this bunny and we put it in a cage, no offense to anyone that it triggers them, but put it in a cage in our house and it's always temperature controlled and stuff, this hare can live their entire life without knowing that they have a trait that makes them white when X amount of parameters are being
Right.
they're being exposed in the population. So, or like a piano, it can play a lot of notes, but it is up to the whatever to the notes,
the pianist to actually hit the keys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you just to give a general idea of what it means to have that full genetic
potential.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Potential and what we do with it.
Right. Yeah, because it's potential versus expression, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like the potential may be there, but you may never get expressed, right?
Yeah,
what genes get turned on and off are based on those environmental inputs. So, but it's important to know what they are because, for example, you may find, and I found out through this, not through genes, but just through a lot of trial and error, for example, that I just don't metabolize carbs. And so I wish I had like some sort of a genetic marker if there had been something very early on, because I spent like 20 years trying to be vegetarian, which is a carb heavy diet before I realized I needed to go full keto. I wish somebody had told me, you know what I mean? Because I wish there was a tool, available to me when I was, a personal trainer and an athlete that I could have just looked at a test and been like, oh no, you don't metabolize carbs, and it doesn't have to be a genetic test. We'll talk about some of the other tests that you can do. So the second factor I like to talk about, and this is the one that's completely under recognized in the biohacking, longevity, health and wellness space, and that's psychometrics. And for those, psychometrics is essentially the modality that quantifies psychology. So psychology, everybody knows what psychology is, I would imagine, but it's, to many people, it feels nebulous, right? Like you lie on a couch and somebody like, well, what was your childhood like? And you talk about that, or what did you dream last night? Right. I mean, those things are, and then how is that interpreted by the psychologist? Right. So that's, so what happened is, psychology has been around for, various forms of well over 100 years. And I think people in that time some hardcore scientists said, well, how could we quantify these things from nebulous into something that are traits that we could measure more clear with greater clarity? And so they came up with a number of different psychometric tools. The most validated one is called the Big Five Ocean. Which we don't have to go into all the details, but I'll just take as an example. Most people are familiar with the idea of extroversion versus introversion, right? So those are not like extreme polarities. They're extreme polarities, but they're on a spectrum. So you don't have to be a extrovert or an introvert. You could be moderately extroverted. And if you're moderately extroverted, that means you're also comfortable being alone, but you're okay, being in groups. But maybe at a certain point, you're kind of like this person who's like, well, you're at a party, but you just had enough, right? Like you're just like, I've had enough. And I need to get out of here because I've just been around people too long. Right. But if you're an extreme extrovert,
you have a podcast. No,
that's right. You'll be on podcasts. You'll be a speaker. Like I score the very high on extroversion. Right. So for me, the pandemic, for example, was like a form of hell. Like Zoom relationships exclusively was like the seventh layer of hell for me. Because I need to be around people. One of the other ways to explain extroversion versus introverts is extroverts gain energy from being around people, whereas introverts drain energy from being around people. So if you're an introvert, you could go into a party. You can still go to a party as an introvert, but after a certain period of time, that energy level has just drained you. And that's when you're like, I got to get out of here, right? There's nothing wrong with this. These are not good or bad traits. They're just traits. And you know what? Sometimes being an introvert is really good because if you say, coming back to scientists, a scientist who works in a lab analyzing, doing experiments, maybe spending a lot of time alone.
Yeah.
An extreme introvert, they will not be a great lab scientist because they will be in the lab by themselves and they will be losing energy by being alone in the lab. Whereas an introvert will be really happy and be doing great experiments. So it's not about saying this is better than that. It's about recognizing that if my orientation is more towards this, then this is the best use of my consciousness, my energy, better career choices. And even in relationships, you know, if you end up being in a relationship where your spouse is more introverted or extroverted is you, and you can have the conversation, but look, well, look, I understand you're going to drain. I'm going to have a lot of fun at this party if we stay the whole night, but you're going to like lose it at about like 11 o'clock, and you need to come to some type of like healthy compromise for to respect your spouse. So this is really important to talk about, but I feel like it's a piece of health that is not acknowledged because it's maybe a bit more around mental health or psychological health. You could even say psycho-spiritual health, but it's not often talked about in a quantifiable way. And so I think this is really important. So I always include psychometrics, and I spent a lot of time personally studying psychometrics. I got certified in a number of different tools.
Yeah, and when we conduct any type of hiring, we're doing like a COBA test or any type of psychometrics that are going to help us then interact with that person or assign that person to a specific role. So I agree with you that obviously it goes a little bit beyond introversion or extroversion, but I agree with you that this is definitely something that we all have an innate sense of what makes us happy or not, as far as like specific actions that we're doing. If we like to eat, I don't know, cake after dinner, it can, you know, we can be happier more or less, but not a lot of people know to classify their psychometrics in a way which would then translate to overall happiness or, you know, promote health and longevity. So I agree with you there. Okay, so and if anyone is interested in that, I really encourage them to just conduct more reading and studying into that area.
Yeah, there's actually a website I would recommend for anybody who does want to understand psychometrics, because they give you free tests on their website for personal use. It's called Truity. Maybe I can give it to you. I don't know if you do show notes. You could put it in the show notes if you want.
Yes.
And you could just go to the site, and then you can do the Big Five Ocean. They have like all of these different psychometric tests that you can self-administer. And what I really like about psychometric testing like this is what we like to say in the industry, the psychometricians, is this is a message from you to you. So this is not like me as a psychometrician telling you how it is. This is from you to you. You do the test, you self-analyze, and you're kind of doing it for yourself. Although some of the really, what I think are some of the most effective psychometric tests is when we do what are called 360s. So it's like you would do the test, then as an associate of yours, I would do the test talking about you, and then we get your spouse, we get your coworkers, we get your family. So we get a full 360, and then we aggregate all of those scores. And that probably is the best way to get a picture of what your true psychometrics are, because sometimes people are really bad at self-assessment and self-reporting when it comes to these things. So just that's enough on psychometrics. We could go down, we could do a whole podcast on, we could do a whole series of podcasts just on psychometrics.
To be frank, my favorite talk that you gave is on decision making, and you went very deeply into psychometrics there.
Right.
I was blown away by that lecture.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Okay, so psychometrics is the second one. What's the third one?
So genetics, psychometrics. The third one that I like to think about is microbiome. And the reason I include this as its own category is not because we have it figured out now, but because I think in the future, this will become a game changer for human health once we get this dialed in. Right now, we're looking here, probably most people listening probably heard about the microbiome, but what we don't realize is the microbiome is extremely complicated. It's not just what's in your gut, as you would well know. It's on your skin, it's in your mouth, it's in your, your ears, your nose, your eyes. Like there's, we are a multitude of organisms and bacteria and cells that are, you know, kind of walking around thinking, you know, we're this person, but we actually are multitude. And so, you know, if we were to really understand the microbiome, I think we would probably have way more effective treatments for disease, you know, because I'm sure people have heard some of the anecdotal stories of people with severe health conditions and had exhausted every form of treatment, and a single series of, for example, fecal transplants completely cured of like severe things, like even things like, you know, Lyme and MS and things that people have been struggling with for decades.
I mean, recently there was a study where they had fecal transplants of top athletes into rats, and those rats performed extremely well. So
it became super rats. Really? I didn't see that study, but I believe it. But that's, I mean, because if you've optimized everything else, that makes sense, because your microbiome then becomes that optimized because of all these other factors. And again, there's a lot of people who are specialists on this. I'm sure maybe even had some on the podcast. Or, you know, so I won't go too deep down that path, but I do believe that microbiome testing is going to be a game changer once we get it dialed in. But right now it's still in the relatively early stages. So when people are claiming, just my 2 cents on this is, when people are claiming that they got a microbiome test that solves everything or answers your questions, be skeptical. Be a skeptical scientist about that, because it's still early stage. So genetics, psychometrics, microbiome, and then the fourth one, one that probably most people think of, is biochemical testing. So this is getting your blood work, right? You go to your doctor. What do? You know, they have somebody come. You know, they have the vampire that comes and drains your blood. You know, called a phlebotomist, and they send that off to the lab, and then you get this big report, right? And so what's really amazing now is there's a lot of different. You know, you can actually even call different companies, and they'll send a phlebotomist to your house now, do the blood draw, and send it off to the lab. You know, so you can either go get this done at your doctor. You can also buy different tests online, where you go to, you know, a lab facility and they do your blood draw. I mean, the amount of biochemical analysis that can be done from your blood. But this doesn't even have to be just blood. It could be blood, it could be urine, it could be saliva, right? So there's a lot of different ways we could measure your biochemical data. And this is something that, like I said, in the past, it used to only be done, you know, by your doctor when you went to go see them. But now, you know, all sorts of urine tests are available at home. You can, you know, they can send you the test for your saliva, not just for genetics, but for cortisol levels, for example, or other things, and spit into the tube. They send it to the lab. So all those different things in the biochemical analysis.
I mean, recently, not recently, I actually had done it, I think, a year and a half ago, but there is a blood test that to measure, to tell you if you have any type of cancer, or most type of cancers active in your body. So I think it's like a 3D type of expansion, right? Also, what we can decipher from blood work, it increases, but also how we can kind of bypass just having to, you know, play vampire and prick someone to get the data. That also expands. And I'm assuming we're going to talk a little bit about, you know, wearables in a second. But so
the biochemical, and actually that thing about cancer detection, early cancer detection, is quite exciting, because there's a lot of companies coming into that space. And now, you know, for those of you not familiar with this, I mean, one of the big reasons cancer is such a source of fear, right? And people say, if you go to your doctor and they come back and it's like, oh, you got the big C, you know, people lose their mind. But that's because typically the cancer screening tools we have now are catching people in like stage 3, stage 4, right? So you have to have built up, like sometimes it's even like a physical tumor is big enough that now we see it on an X-ray, like they didn't even catch it. So it's like you physically see, holy smokes, I got this lump here. What the hell is this thing? Oh, it's a tumor, right? Not the tumor, but it's actually something that has grown to that size. But if you can now do these blood biopsies and they can catch your cancer at like a stage 1, your chances of survival are 90%, right? 95%. Whereas you catch at stage 4, your chances of survival go down sometimes in some of these cancers to like 10 or 20%. So this is why cancer is such a scary thing, you know. But if we could catch cancers now at stage 1, which a lot of tests are coming out that can do that, then, you know, that's the preventative that I said off the bat, right? Like, let's talk about prevention. Let's not wait until people have cancer. Let's go upstream. And then if you catch it at stage 1, it's not just about taking the drug, but it's about looking at your lifestyle changes that you need to make, so you don't create an environment in your body where cancer can thrive.
Yeah, to your point, most people are going to die with cancer and not from cancer.
Yes.
Cancer is mostly a problem when it goes outside of the organ it originates from. So yeah, this is definitely, it's going to be like a two-pronged monster here, right? Like one area is going to be, more people are going to be able to treat cancer at its early stages, but we're going to have a lot more people walking around scared because they got diagnosed with cancer, right?
Right. Yeah. So if you do get one of these new cutting edge cancer, the idea is to catch it early. So caveat there. And then of course the fifth one, the thing that I'm probably best known for, is biometrics. So this is, all of your wearables. This is over the last 5 years have become rather ubiquitous. Most people have some experience with the wearable, whether it's an Apple Watch or the Samsung Watch or a Whoop or an Oura Ring or some other tool, that even a pulse oximeter on their finger, which everybody was using during COVID, because we discovered that if you're as people suddenly, I used to talk about SpO2 5 years ago, people would, what's that, what's SpO2? During COVID, like everybody knows what SpO2 is now, right? If your SpO2 drops below 90%, you run to the hospital now, because everybody got those pulse oximeters on your at home, right, to monitor these levels. So there's a whole bunch of biometrics that we can monitor through wearables, and now even moving to ambient technology. These are going to become very, very, I think, important, because, as people want to conduct their own citizen science experiments, you need to kind of dial in all 5 of these factors. So you can do all of these different tests. The reason I like biometrics so much is because they're something you can measure day by day change. So your genetics don't change very much, right? Or don't change at all. And then your psychometrics are not supposed to change very much over your lifetime. Yeah, they're relatively stable. Your microbiome is also, I put my 5 from like the least changing to the most changing, right? If you saw my presentation, right? So genetics don't change, biometrics change the most. Biochemical, so if you get your blood labs done every 3 months, that's probably the highest cadence of any physician I've ever asked, like how, or professional, like how is the most often you would get your blood drawn to look at a change on a blood marker. It's about 3 months, but biometrics change day by day, hour by hour. So it's it's a way, if you really want to dial in tight to a protocol and conduct your own science experiment, as a citizen scientist on yourself, biometrics are a great tool, because I could take I know my baseline sleep data based upon my wearable of choice, doesn't matter, I don't care what it is. And then I take a sleep supplement, and then I can see, well, did the supplement work? Did it change my baseline data? Of course, not the first night, but over a period of time, or you can see I've seen some pretty amazing biometric changes from different things I've tested over the years, things that just activate your parasympathetic nervous system very rapidly. And, so you can see that, hey, I was not doing good. An example I gave actually my talk at RAADFest was, I went and I could see I was using my Whoop for this particular one. I said I was in green, and then I went to yellow, and then I had 2 days in the red. So my HRV, my recovery score, was going down. That was a sign like, oh, now I could potentially be at risk of getting sick. So the next day, I'm not going to go to the gym and try to set a personal record of lifting the most weight, or I'm not going to push my body. I'm going to go into a recovery day. So what do? I went and got an immune boosting IV. I went and did, I have like those compression legs, foam rolling. I did all these things to sort of recover my nervous system. And lo and behold, boom, my recovery score the next day was like a 95. So that's how you dial it in, to essentially monitor yourself and to decide what are the things you need to do each and every day to optimize your recovery and your general health.
Yeah, especially, if we talk about skin health and how we translate it, obviously we can talk about continuous glucose monitoring, our relationship with glucose,
right?
And then how we can relate that data to what we ate at that time of day, and kind of making sure that we adjust our diet. as an anecdote, the reason is because glucose is associated with a lot of things that are detrimental to the health. But one of the things that are maybe the most crucial as far as our skin is concerned is glycation. We eat glucose, we get glycation end products, and these glycation end products basically make our skin, our collagen in our skin, less supple. Our skin as a whole, create wrinkles, etc. So if I should scare someone into wearing a blood glucose monitor, which was interesting because until like I'd say 5 years ago, if you had one on your hand, it was screaming, "Hi, I am diabetic," right?
Yes.
And now it's maybe the opposite. It's like, "Hi, I am a person that is interested in like peak performance," or something like that.
Well, I mean, it is. I talked about this, and I thought it was very interesting as someone who was in the wearable space. So I used to be talking about like biometrics, but I've actually had to change it to what I call now biosensors, because a continuous glucose monitor tip is actually doing a biochemical analysis on the body. So that's the next phase of wearables, is actually moving from just biometrics, which are predominantly driven by you know, for example, like ECG, electrical signals from the heart, electrocardiograms, or PPG signals using light to shine through the skin and extracting data from that. But now we're moving towards a stage where we're going to actually have these biosensors, continuous glucose monitors being the most ubiquitous example today, where you put that on your body and now you can monitor. It has a little interstitial nodule that goes into the skin, for those people not familiar with the CGM. And so it does have to penetrate the skin, and then it measures through the fluid, you know, here's what your glucose levels are in the blood. And they're out working now on non-invasive continuous glucose monitors that don't even need to pierce the skin. But what's really interesting is that on the continuous glucose monitor, I mean, I don't think people should be scared into getting involved in. It doesn't mean you're diabetic. It's really good to do because I'm a fan of the work of Dr. Robert Lustig and colleagues that talk about that every single disease is downstream of metabolic dysfunction. And I think this is true. I think the only thing that's upstream of metabolic dysfunction, and we talked about this briefly just before we started recording, is mental health. Right. Is that like of course the foundation of everything from a health standpoint is the mental health, but you know, when you develop metabolic dysfunction, you're essentially at risk for every possible disease and disorder you could develop. So knowing where you land in CGM, where your glucose levels are and your insulin response levels and your metabolic health is extremely important. And unfortunately to say this, 90% of Americans are considered to be metabolically dysfunctional today.
But Elias, I will actually connect between the two things that you just said, and that's something actually I really want to talk to you about specifically, because first of all, we know that stress affects metabolic health. It affects our relationship with glucose. It affects cortisol specifically. You know, it can spike blood sugar levels. It can make us less sensitive to insulin, which is kind of saying the same thing, but also. But also, you know, is our mental health can be affected from the amount of stress or the amount of emotional currency we give those metrics. What we are starting to see, I think, in the last, I don't know, 10 years for sure, but in the last few years, even more stark, is people who are developing a type of eating disorder that is associated with paying too much attention to what they're eating, too much attention to their biometrics. And do you feel like we're starting to develop a type of unhealthy, or some of us unhealthy relationship with the information, that over information?
Yeah, this is obviously been a delicate topic for me to talk about as a health advocate. Is because the extreme end of being health conscious is something called orthorexia. I think that's how you pronounce it, right? It's just like the hyper vigilance, right? So it's like almost like anorexia around food, but it's kind of around all of these things, right? Like you just become hyper vigilant, and you can't do anything. Like I can't have an ounce of like the tiniest little bit of a brownie, you know, like it's going to break my diet, you know, or I can't go a single day without doing my 10-minute meditation. So you're stressing about your meditation. Like, that's not how it's supposed to work, people,
Yeah.
so you can go too extreme down that path. And the reason I don't like to talk about this much is because people will use that as a way to discard the
Yes.
fact that, like, well, I don't want to do that, so I'm not even going to try. And it's like, no, 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 no. Like, you need to be concerned about your health. You need to be actively a participant in modulating your own health. You need to become a citizen scientist and start testing on yourself to optimize yourself, because nobody else will. But
Yeah.
yes, on the extreme side, there are some people that get too intense about this. And in all things, as the Buddha said, the middle path, in
Yeah.
all things, right? So there's a balance to be had, and one of the things I like to say on this, just before we move on, is the idea that if you are anti-fragile, if you are a healthy individual who's resilient, you can go out and have that seed oil meal with the big brownie at the end and drink and get wasted drunk if you want, and you're going to recover, right? Because you are optimized. So
Yeah.
you don't need to be afraid of that. I mean, that's part of being anti-fragile. Being anti-fragile is you can input anything at me and I'm adaptable, right? I'm an adaptable, responsive, powerful being, and I can take on whatever you throw at me.
I think it's also being anti-fragile with your habits, right? I mean, it's
Yes.
and you're my guru of habits. But really, if you have self trust, you trust yourself that whatever one day of pigging out or whatever you're doing there is not going to break your mental capacity to hold on to your habits and kind
Right.
of maintain a healthy lifestyle overall. But I do feel that I do meet a lot of people that are on a very thin edge between wanting to live forever and wanting to not live another day, right? It's kind of
Yes.
it's how do we relate longevity and mental health? How do we approach this
I mean, this
topic?
has become the thing. This is going to be like my next few talks the next talks that I'm working on right now is exactly on this point, because I think we've hit a critical mass stage here. And for those of you who didn't read recently, there was something that was just published last month in the Lancet journal, a science journal, for those of you who are familiar with it, that said that we went from about 8.6% of Americans self-reporting as being in depression to almost 30% during the pandemic as of 2021. So we tripled the amount of people that were depressed in 2 years.
Yeah.
And that's an astoundingly scary statistic. And of course, the vast majority of them were young people. And unfortunately, a lot of women, I think, but this was across all genders, all spectrums, all age groups, all nationalities across the board. We saw a massive increase in depression and anxiety. And we're seeing this, I'm sure everybody listening to this probably themselves faced moments of anxiety and depression in the last few years. And this is not just a pandemic related issue. This is related to, I think E.O. Wilson said it best. He says, we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And these three things combined it's like too much. It's just too much for us to cope with, right? Because our emotions are still hunter-gatherer emotions, which I'm sure many people have heard, and I don't even need to talk about that.
Yeah.
But our brains haven't changed in hundreds of thousands of years in terms of how they operate, right? So the things about like the amygdala and being hypervigilant for threats and all of this, and then the institutions that are serving us are medieval, right? So things like the banking and the whole way the educational system and the way all these things are kind of designed, government have been designed, and they're kind of haven't changed in 1,000 years, and not changed enough, I guess you could say. And then all of a sudden, boom, in the last 20 years, we developed godlike technology.
Correct. Yeah.
So how do you deal with this, right? Like you have modern humanity has a pretty intense challenge that we're facing. And I think the first casualty of this challenge is the collective mental health of the planet. So we need to really talk about this.
Yeah, and the question is, so as you mentioned, we see two things. We see, people or brains that are, designed to deal with a world that is pretty much the biological world or the physical world, right? And
Right.
now what we are dealing with is a technology that is built predominantly to piggyback on that. It's not a technology that communicates in physical or biological terms. It activates those with artificial mechanisms,
Right. It's actually
piggybacking on.
hacking. It's actually hacking directly. Tristan Harris,
Yes,
and everybody, I would
exactly.
encourage you to go look this up. Look. I mean, if anyone saw this, the Social Dilemma, Tristan Harris in the Center of Humane Technology, he calls it the race to the bottom of the brainstem.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very appropriate um, representation of what's actually going on, right? So we started with. Sorry to interrupt you, but go
No,
ahead and
you're
finish
good.
your thought. So we started with Facebook and Twitter, and then Instagram was sort of the next thing. And so what he means about the race to the bottom of the brainstem is like now we're at like TikTok stage, right? So
Mm-hmm.
TikTok is like triggering the most basic neurological responses that humans could possibly respond to, like hyper fast, overwhelmingly intense data coming in at a very rapid pace. So like literally it bypasses all of your conscious ability to navigate, right? The forebrain, the thoughtful processing of the brain is complete disengaged from that. It's just you're
Mm-hmm.
just going straight to the bottom of the brainstem. You're directly and all of this politicization of everything. It's
Mm-hmm.
all about triggering the amygdala. It's just like an amygdala hijack here, an amygdala hijack there. Every news article headline is just another amygdala hijack for whatever side or tribe you belong to.
Yeah, it's almost like everything that is coming at you is basically saying the other tribe is coming to get you, or the
Yes.
tiger is coming to get you, or
Yes.
whatever that is.
Exactly.
But aside from, so for me, the only thing I would know how to deal with it is maybe mindfulness practices and very intense exercise. These are the only two things that I could think of that help me as a human deal with this type of artificial world that is targeting the race for the brainstem. But what is the what do you see? Like, what are some of the things that you think will develop in the future to
I
help us
think
live to 800 years old, but happy doing it, right?
right. Well, I think the number one thing, if you want to think like an immortal, and this is, I guess, a preview of what I'm going to talk about, but I think to think like an immortal, you got to live a life deserving of immortality, right? So we have a very rich tradition of what this means. This is essentially to be a mythic figure. This is to become in your own life, you, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, whoever's listening to this, regardless of what's in your environment, you are the hero or the angel in somebody's story, and not just your own. And this is the key point. It's not just your story either. Who are you in the story of others around you? Are you a source? Are you the villain? Right? I mean, in some cases, probably some people in my life, I've lived long enough now, I probably have some people might have seen me as the villain for a moment, right?
Yeah.
But you need to live a story that feels like you are part of some sort of grander purpose. And this is this is to me one of the key things that we've lost, because everybody used to believe that that was sort of the goal, and in some capacity, right, to live that. And it doesn't have to be this big complicated hero's journey where you're overcoming the greatest demons. Your demon in the cave could be getting to the gym. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe that's the demon you have to slay. It could be studying, like reading a book. That could be the demon, the procrastination, the demon of procrastination on TikTok. Slay that demon and read the book and get smarter. Like that's maybe the demon you have to face, right? Or the dragon in the lair. So what I mean by this is that if you start looking at your own life in a way that's more epic, because even though you don't have to be in the world being a huge public figure, you could be the angel to your grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's an epic choice, to be the person who's their guardian angel for them. That can be in your family, that can be amongst your friends, that could be, the small acts, don't always just look at them as being small. I think that's an
Yeah.
important thing to differentiate now, because I think what has happened with all of this information coming in is we all feel small and insignificant.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to not look at yourself through that lens. I think it's a dangerous way to look at your own life.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think what I hear and tie to is all of those, blue zone longevity research, looking at being and perceiving yourself as part of the community,
Yes.
part of a bigger cause or purpose, or group than your own, connecting to a higher purpose or power to those of us that it speaks to. These are not only recipes. When we started this conversation, we were talking about, health span and lifespan, and really what we are again coming back to is maybe another circle in that Venn diagram, which is kind of a happiness span, right? Or like a fulfillment span.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. PM. No, but the ability to have the same umbrella covering love of life and joy of life, right?
Yes, and I think, like, to me, that blue zone comparison is actually something I'm going to talk about. The mythic life is the individual piece, but you're absolutely right. The other piece is tying that your own mythic story to the collective,
mm-hmm.
right, and being part of a community. And I think one of the other things that has created a lot of this anxiety and depression that we're seeing is the fact that it's an old saying, but I think it's what's true, is like, if you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything.
Mm-hmm.
Or I think it's, if you don't stand up for something, you'll fall for anything. But you have to believe. Like, we kind of declared God dead, and we thought that was the end of it. We're all going to be scientists, and we're going to go into this other place. But in the absence of the belief and the ability to participate in a larger story, humans actually go a little crazy.
Yeah.
It just seems to be what happens. We have to find something that makes us feel like we're tied to a larger tribe, a larger purpose, and a greater power.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that greater power becomes a demagogue, right, or a cult leader, then people will submit to that instead of submitting to a higher power of love.
Yeah.
And then they will become part of that tribe, and they will start behaving this way. And this is something we can observe in our society directly. So this has been the drawback of a secular world. And I would have never predicted this as somebody who is, considers myself to be a scientist, but has also studied a lot of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always struggled how to be in both worlds at the same time. How do I combine my passion for the scientific method and my true belief that it is the greatest system of understanding the world around us that has ever been invented, is the scientific method. But I've always wanted to also study spiritual traditions and myths, and I always thought like these were like something was wrong with me for being interested in both of these at the same time. But now I realize it's the synthesis of those two things that is going to be essential for us to survive. If humanity wants to survive, we have to come to a synthesis position between these two things. We can't be just a scientific civilization or just a religious civilization. We have to find a synthesis. And, I wish, if I had the answer to that, I wish I did. I'd be, screaming it from the mountaintops. But I think that's kind of what we're all trying to figure out right now.
Yeah, I think there are examples for it, whether if we look through evolutionary terms or through through
Anthropological?
anthropological lens, because we can look at traditions like the Chinese or Japanese tradition, especially Japanese, which is looking at the as the single, as a part of a collective, and
Right.
we can talk about like mask wearing when you're sick in order not to infect other people, or the way that you're viewing yourself as part of a cog in a large society, that your actions kind of have a butterfly effect in the end. But we can also look at the way that we have designed, from being animals, we evolved to associate, things that happen with cause, like cause and effect, right? And we can understand that if something happened, something else caused it, right? That's why we are going.
Well, that's the joke. I think I don't know if everyone has seen this, but I remember when I was quite young, there's like a cartoon of like two cavemen walking, and the lightning hits one of them, and not the other. And so, what is the guy who doesn't get hit by lightning looks up and says, "Well, it must have been something up there likes me," right? And that's kind of how we invented God. Is this idea of something up there likes me? Didn't like him because it struck him dead. But likes me, so now I'm going to go and make an offering to whatever that thing is, right? Because we couldn't explain the natural phenomena. So scientists will use that as like, oh, well, look how primitive and stupid that thinking is. But what it turns out, actually, and I think it was Carl Jung who said this, is that, in all of his work of researching religion and mythology, he said, look, I can't say for sure whether God exists or not, but I can say that the people who believe in God are more psychologically healthy.
Yes.
I think this is a fascinating idea for people to realize. So it's almost like it doesn't matter if God is real or not, but you actually do better psychologically if you believe in something like that, because it just helps balance your mind. And
I think
I'm not saying people should suddenly jump out and go join a religion and become religious, but I think it's important for us to look at this in the context of mental health. And it's something people aren't talking about from what I can see. And I think it's an important point.
Would you say it's exceedingly important because we're living at kind of in a strange society? Do you think it goes hand in hand, or it supplements lack of a closer knit village-like group that most of us do not enjoy?
Right. I think the key to us actually transitioning into a healthier society is combining these two things, finding something greater than oneself to serve. I think that's a key. And that doesn't have to be, I mean, churches or synagogues or the mosques have fulfilled this role in many ways, because people go, they gather as a community, and then often they go do charitable work, right, together as part of what they do. So even if you don't belong to one of those institutions, because we said they're medieval, right? So they're a medieval institution, maybe we want to do something more modern, but we have to find a way to serve something greater than one's own self. And that's key. And we need to do it in community of some kind with other people of like mind, because we are tribal beings. Coming back to those Paleolithic emotions, if we're not in we're going to join some type of a tribe. So if that tribe online, and that could be a tribe that say, pick any issue, right? Pro-gun, anti-gun, right? So I'm a pro-gun guy. I'm going to go online and I'm going to join my pro-gun tribe. And if I'm an anti-gun, I'm going to go online and join that. It doesn't matter. I don't care what tribe it is. You're going to just fall in with that group. So choose it consciously. Ideally, find people around you that you could physically interact with who share some of those values. And ideally, collectively, go do some good in the world together that is serving somebody other than yourselves, not just for the benefit of your tribal group, but something for other people possibly in need of some kind. And you know what? That's actually going to make you way happier.
Yeah.
And just trying to serve yourself.
I agree. I love the fact that you said choose it consciously. I think we should do another podcast talking about like conscious decision making,
right?
Living consciously, developing habits, etc. Really, I know I keep repeating it, but I think you're my guru in this area, and I love to share you with the world. Elias, because as anyone who has heard can tell, you are a wealth of knowledge, and you are someone that people should aim their let's call it their attendance in conferences or talks according to whether you'll be there or not. So obviously we're going to have in the show notes how to find you, etc. But could you share with us where are some of the next events that you're going to be a part of and talking at?
I'm going to be part of How Do You Health in Austin, which will be at the beginning of December. I was there last year. I don't think you were there. You're going to come this year, I believe. It was a
that's correct.
blast. We were at a beautiful something called the Music Hill Ranch in the Lakeway district outside of Austin on this big piece of land. And we were out there playing, doing yoga in the morning. And we actually filled the pool with ice. We got 2 pallets of ice and threw it in the pool and all jumped in.
Wow.
So it was real community. I mean, it was really one of the best feelings of community that I had, because this wasn't like in a cold conference room, hotel somewhere. This was like we were on the land as a community, talking, sharing, playing, and it was very fulfilling for that reason. So I'll be there, and I imagine that event happens every December. So hopefully, even if you miss this year, I'll be back again the next year. I'm doing a couple private speaking events. In December, I'm doing one for actually New Year's Eve. I'm doing one in actually it's going to be with the RAADFest group, People Unlimited. I think it is open to some people in the public in Phoenix. I'll be doing that for New Year's. And then I'm doing a private event in Vegas in January right now that I have booked, but that's closed. And then I'm actually going to be working on doing some of my own events with some of my other partners and collaborators in the space in 2023. So I'm going to revamp my website, which you said will be in the show notes. But the best way to follow me, I am on Instagram, but I try to stay off Instagram because I think it's bad for my dopamine levels. So I modulate my Instagram interaction. The only place I'm the most active is on LinkedIn. So if you want to find me on LinkedIn, I tend to talk about what I'll be doing and the work that I'm interested in there.
Great. And obviously we reshare whatever event you're going to be at. We make sure to reshare it because again, we believe you're a wealth of knowledge. So yeah, Elias, thank you very, very, very much. You are, I don't know what else I can say. Yeah, the world's most interesting person,
No, I wouldn't go that far, but I appreciate the comment. Thank you.
And I thank you for this conversation today. And yeah, stay tuned for the next podcast we're going to do on decision making.
All right, perfect. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you got something useful.
Yes, sir. Thank you.